same way to create a node. We're going to use the tests, like the flippy one, for now. So you'll see that, but you'll also see it show up here. So this is your scene graph. So everything in USD kind of, there's like a starting point, and then everything is attached to that starting point. So that starting point is called the root, and then in this case, we have rubber toy, which is under, everyone might have to come forward because it's really small. But it's called rubber toy, and it's a primitive, and within the primitive, there's the geometry and the shader. But we're gonna override these anyway. So the one key, here, I'll set up a scene first. So we'll make a material using a material library node. Oh, another big difference between USD and regular Houdini, all of your scene is like set up like you would do a merge node. So if you have materials, geometry, a light, it's all merged together, and then at the end, that's what's rendered. So it's kind of like a view flag in a regular geometry container. So if you double click inside the material library, this is where you create your materials. There isn't like a material context. You don't have to click on that. If we're going with material X, you can type subnet or subnet USD material X subnet, and then I hit enter to create it. I'll just say green, and then within this we have the standard surfacing nodes from material X. So there's the surface and then the displacement, which controls displacement. This material X surface node is a little odd, so you can just delete it and create material X, a standard surface. So this will work a lot like your Redshift standard material or your Arnold material builder, or Arnold standard surface. I'm just going to condense all of that right now, because we just want to make a green shader. We don't really care about importing maps into this. Just choose out. And this is like in Arnold where it has the out material thing. So you can just change this to green, and this behaves very similarly. Now to assign this material, you can do stuff like this and choose your material path, which is in here. Oh, never mind. I don't know why it's not showing up. It should take it from right here. But there's an easier way. You can just hit clear and autofill, and now you have the green material back in. But we need to assign this to geometry. Make sure this checkbox is on. Otherwise, it's just creating the shaders and it's not actually assigning anything. So this is good if you want to create a bunch of shaders up at the top and then switch through them later on. But I want to assign the shader right now to the object. So you can do this two ways. You can either just drag the rubber toy geometry in, or maybe the geo of it, like that. Or there's an easier way if you're doing one object at a time before you merge. You can just there's a drop-down menu right here, and you can just select inputs last modified primitive, and this will take, it's not working, but or all geometry ranges, and this will just assign the material to all the mesh. So this is like putting a material node at the very bottom of your tree after you merge everything, so it just uniformly assigns the material to everything that's above it. Now that we got that out of the way, let's add some lighting. So unlike Houdini, where if you have Redshift or Arnold loaded, or even Mantra, they all have separate types of lights, and that's because each renderer doesn't know how to interpret each different type of light. So, you know, Karma doesn't, or Redshift doesn't know how to interpret a mantra light. So they're completely different render engines. But in this case, there's a standard definition for a light, and all the properties are largely the same. So each renderer doesn't need a custom definition. You can just use a light and it works for all of them. This like universal approach is very common in USD. We'll get to render settings later on. But I can create a light, and then like in regular Houdini, you can look through a light, place it, make sure that lock is on so it actually affects. This, I'm just going to blast it. And we can just unlock. And like in regular Houdini, you can also control click to create camera. And it's already locked, so we can move around here. And have a camera. And instead of going to the out context, you need to create your render settings here. That's because everything in USD is considered a primitive. So think of all of the lights, cameras, materials, geometry, they're all kind of like a geonode. So you create primitives, and all of those primitives get merged together to create your final scene. So you need to add a render settings primitive. There are presets for certain render engines, but you can also use just the standard render settings log. And this has no effect on what you see in the viewport right now. This is just for final render. So we can pick our camera here. So if we had another camera, so like this, we had two cameras in our tree. We can pick from which camera we'd like. So I can go ahead, camera 2 right here, and we can see there's a render primitive right here, and we have both our cameras here. So that's because it's being created. It takes the node name and puts it under a camera's primitive. So all of your cameras are under that primitive, and it's just adding, or under that like folder, subfolder, and all of your cameras primitives are getting added to it. So we can just pick our camera. We want camera 2. You can do a resolution override here as well. Here's where you change like focal length and aperture. And there are also some common specific settings here as well to determine how the camera is used in the render. But a lot of your output settings, like the resolution, if you want padding as well, that's all here. So I'm gonna pick this down to 720, just so we can go a little faster. And there are some more settings here that allow you to override things. So I'm gonna change our rendering engine to XPU, so we can go a little faster. If you wanna edit anything, these little toggles are very important. If you click on one of them, set or create allows you to basically do an override. Set if exists. Another override, add if exists, that's adding primitives or properties to the primitive if it already doesn't have it. You would do this because as you add more properties to a primitive, it gets heavier and heavier. So this is more useful in geometry primitives. Block, that's kind of an override, and do nothing. It does nothing. It just passes in what it's given. So we're all good there. And now if you want to preview your work before, you can stop the chain here. We can go over here to the viewport, and this is another difference between regular Houdini and Solaris, is you can preview with your render engine in the viewport right here. So this is Karma render. Let me switch it back to CPU. So here's this is an OpenGL. So here's a Karma render. You can see it's kind of slow, but it is rendering. It's doing full path tracing. Another useful hotkey here is Shift P, which pauses your render. So it's like hitting the play button in Redshift, so you can work faster. Just be wary. Sometimes switching between Karma and Houdini, like OpenGL, can cause some issues. So if your Karma render is ever getting stuck, you can pause, switch to OpenGL, hit Shift P again to resume in OpenGL to get unstuck. So now that you can see your stuff in the viewport, a render in the viewport, I get a preview. We want to put this on farm, so I don't want to wait forever to render. So we'll put down a USD ROP, not a USD render ROP, a USD ROP. And this outputs a .usd file at the end. A USD render ROP will export an image for you. That's very convenient when you're working on a machine, but for the farm, it needs that USD file and all the information within it to render properly. So we're going to say render a specific frame range. If you're trying to render a frame with outside of this frame range, it'll just default to the closest frame. So it's kind of like a time shift, or when you're in Nuke and you have missing frames within that closest frame setting. So I have frames 1 through 240, but if we submitted this to the farm, it wouldn't work right now. The reason for this is because this piece of geometry, let me make sure, okay. This piece of geometry is being referenced from Houdini. You should think of USD completely outside of Houdini because the renders think of it that way. The renders have no idea what's going on with USD, or with stuff that you import from the geo context. So if you put down a SOP create, or a SOP import, or SOP modify, any of these things that say SOP, it's going to break on the farm if you don't cache it out. There are, in the future, this may not be a problem because they're thinking of using Houdini engine as a procedural inside of render delegates, so it can evaluate Houdini stuff inside of USD rather than the other way around. But that still hasn't even been released. It's in use at Pixar by a Scad alum, Sasha Willette, but it is not ready for prime time yet, and it hasn't been released as a plugin, so hold your horses. So to cache this, we'll use a USD ROP again, and I'm just going to export this. I realized I never put a project folder on this. One second. I'm going to save this project file to our demo. And now, within that, I'm going to save this as a flippy.usd file within the geometry folder. So kind of our standard way of caching things out. If this was being animated, you'd have to obviously render the frame range, but since it's not, we can get away with just rendering one frame. So that's done. And now we'll use a reference node. This is kind of like a file node in regular Houdini. There are other ways to reference in USD, but this is the simplest way. So here in the file pattern, kind of like your Redshift HDRI, you can just go in, grab what you want, and it should be back. And this right here eliminates any dependency on Houdini. So theoretically, if we went into Maya, I'm just going to launch that in the background, we can open up this whole scene in Maya and it will transfer perfectly. So now that we're done with that, I'm going to render out our actual final USD file that includes all the cameras, all the geo, all the lights. So I'm actually going to render this out right under the project folder, so it'll be side by side with the hit NC file. So I'll just do flippy render. Save that frame. And we should be good to go. So now we can see in the Karma demo folder, we have Flippy project, Flippy render, and within Geo, if we do, we have Flippy USD. So you logged into the render farm with us?
I did.
Okay. So if we copy that over to our render farm folder, we can now submit this as a job. So you'll see there's a USD file here at the end. This is what you want to pick to render. This enables.
I think you're.
Oh. Okay, I'll zoom in again. So this USD file is what we want to render. If you submit a HIP file, it won't work because only USD files kind of activate the options for USD render delegates, such as Karma, Arnold, I guess Redshift and V-Ray, but we don't have those enabled right now. We only have Redshift, Karma and Arnold enabled for USD rendering. So just select that. We only have one frame. Houdini Karma. Right now, only the 19.5 versions work. Maybe that'll get upgraded to 20. We'll see. Standard RAM and core controls. And if you're rendering with XPU, then you can turn this on. If not, just leave it off. So we can render that, and this should be, oh, never mind. Well, we can render it locally.
What is an XPU?
XPU
Is that just, is X like variable for like?
It's GPU plus CPU, so it can
Okay.
use resources from both to make it run faster. What it can do is, what it can also do is, if your GPU is failing, it can fall back to the CPU. But in reality, you're gonna get a slightly different render because the architecture of the renderer can't be the same because you have GPU coding and CPU coding, and whatever you do, it won't be the same. So you kind of have to pick. What a lot of people do, or what I've heard people do, is they'll use XPU for look dev, and then when they put it on the farm, they'll switch it to CPU because most farms are CPU farms rather than GPU farms. So go here. I'm gonna mimic what the farm command does. In your render settings, you can also pick. Oh, just kidding. Do you remember where to set the Essence? Do you remember where to put the export path?
I didn't look it up on the machine.
Okay, we'll just use a USD render off then. Yeah. This is how you can render the frame. So you pick your render settings, which is a primitive, and then the override output image will set to render .exr. And we'll just make an EXR folder here as well. So we can just
If you do the, Karma render, I mean, it's a path.
yeah, it will, but I'm trying to be more agnostic.
Yeah, but it works automatically, so on your, you take Karma and then you get a path.
Okay.
Or I can use it as cheat sheet.
Yeah. I got it mostly right. So, if you're using Karma, this is actually a really nice node. Arnold has the same, a similar node that will let you set all of these render settings in a way that's a little easier to understand. So you can switch between GPU or CPU and XPU, set your resolution here, what camera you want to render, and what your file name is, and what render settings you want to use. So this all looks pretty good. Oh, Deep does not work on Farm right now. I don't know if anyone was using it, but it doesn't work. So put this in to our render WAP. Yeah, we can render to this. Oh. What's going on? Let me just see if there's anything in here. Okay, so we have our test EXR. I'm not sure if it's done yet, but we'll see. Yep. So here's our rendered image. And that's kind of how you use USD on the farm.
Are Olympics obsolete with this workload, or would you just write all your geo out as USD files?
You can reference in Olympics as well. The USD is technically more efficient than Olympics, so if you cached it in USD, it would be more efficient. Yeah, and they both support the same pathing attributes, like USD write as well, or UV write as well. But the nice thing with caching out as USD is you can set like a default print. So you could have your root or like your folder. You can cache out, you wouldn't do this, but you could cache out like 4 models at once, and then when you, I guess Olympic does that as well. Like setting your, what prim you want to read from. But it's more optimized for USD workflow. Yeah.
I guess that brings up the next question. The name attribute, is that how you separate pieces of the model?
So there's these things called subsets, but Will Kavanaugh was saying they're a little slow. But yeah, that's a way to separate them out. Yeah.
If you're interested in using this on Windows at home, you can also do an online with Scad.
Yeah.
I
And
tested out in 18, so it's been used. Karma's been around for a while,
yeah.
but GPU was not out of beta until 20. So that's why we're excited about it, because we want to use it export.
Yeah. Trying to think of other things.
Is there any things on the farm to avoid large gigabytes of files?
Yes. So if we go back here and we look at our USD render raw, this save style control is very important. We want to preserve references. So this is like saying $hit. USD knows how to interpret $hit when it saves through here. But if you change this to flatten stage, or yeah, if you change this to flatten stage, it will cache all of your geometry in a single file per frame. So it's basically like submitting your entire Houdini scene as an Alembic rather than referenced out. So that can get really big really quick. I accidentally turned this on for Saw, he's not in the room, but his file ended up being 80 gigabytes and it probably could have been 1. So don't do that. Oh, I wanted to show you this. I guess it didn't show up. But now that we have an Alembic out, or a USD file out, we can open this up in other software. If we were on Windows, I could show you Unreal, or on Linux. I would avoid Maya 2022 with this because their USD support wasn't that great. It was still kind of coming in. But if you want to, you can go to Windows. General Editor's USD layer editor, and then you can create stage from file, and we can go in and find our file. Our demo of Flippy render USD. And now we have all the data that we created in Houdini. So our light, our model, our shaders, our cameras are all there. So if you want to work in Maya, or if you want to do like your camera animation in Maya, you can import your whole scene and just export the camera back out as an edit layer.
So how well do shaders and materials transfer? Because a lot of renderers have their own nodes, and those usually don't go out. Does Karma work well with others?
So I think you should. Karma's in a little bit of an odd position because it can use shaders from Mantra and it can use Material X at the same time. And I think vsfx did that because they wanted to drive the adoption of Karma. So they made it compatible so people could like, import their workflows in and not have to rebuild everything. But the Mantra shaders won't work in any other software.
Okay. So Material X is supported in other software?
Material X, think of Material X as like the USD but for shading. And there are pushes. Not sure if it's happened yet. It might have, but Material X may be included in USD, so it would be cemented as the way to create shaders within USD. And then you're dealing with two open source standards that are compatible throughout the industry, throughout software. So hopefully everything will play nice. Material X is also supported in Arnold. It isn't supported in Redshift. I'm not sure about V-Ray, but Material X, since it's supported in Arnold, it's supported in Maya. So any shader that you create there that isn't dependent on some custom Houdini Material X nodes should come in just fine.
How about like a texture map? If you had a word texture map that you apply to the material X.
Those should be referenced relatively from your USD file. So those
So you
should.
reference it from the USD then not through the Houdini.
So when you do $hip like texture in Material X or in Houdini, it'll save that as a relative reference. So when you export that USD file, all of those paths will become relative to the USD file, not to the HIP file. I think.
Okay.
I haven't tested that yet.
You can also convert your USD file into ASCII format and actually look at them as well.
Yes, and that's something that Will did throughout the presentations that he did. And you can see like kind of the equivalent of if you did a transform node, but with one line of code. So it's also very nice to kind of debug what's going on in your scene if you have to do that. Yeah. One other note, Material X support is in an odd place with Unreal. So it converts all of the Material X shading networks into Substrate, which is their more advanced, or their advanced material shading system, or shader creation system. So you can't really take your shaders back out of Unreal, but you can create Material X, and there should be a pretty good representation of them in Unreal when they're converted. Yeah. That's a lot of what I had.
So, I actually don't know much about how Blender's handling USD. I've heard whispers that it supports it, but haven't seen anything about it. I don't know if you know anything.
So there was a company called Tangent Animation, or Tangent. I don't know what the last part was. They created a whole film for Netflix in Blender and wrote a lot of the USD pipeline for it. And then their second movie didn't kind of come through. It got canceled and the studio shut down. So a lot of the Blender USD stuff is from Tangent, but I'm not sure how much further support it's gotten. However, NVIDIA and Apple and Epic have given the Blender Foundation a lot of money, and while I think in their bylaws it says they can't influence what features get supported, a lot of them are after USD support because all of those companies want to use USD for, in Apple's case, they want to standardize their format and make their Vision Pro all USD. They want everything in iOS to be USD, specifically USDZ, which is like a zip version that includes the textures in the file. Don't use that for CG rendering though. That's more for real-time stuff. NVIDIA wants to use it for NVIDIA Omniverse, for machine learning training, metaverse stuff, and general large-scale productions. Adobe wants to go to USD to standardize as well. I'd say a lot of people are jumping on it, and Blender is definitely one of those softwares. But I'm not sure about Material X and Blender. I'm not sure if there's much there.